Hi, so I'm actually outside the Presidential Carter Museum and Library, and I'm actually a bit overwhelmed simply because of the kind of person that Carter was and the kind of person that all politicians should aspire to. And it's hard to express just how many things Carter did in his lifetime. But just during his time as President of the United States, between, I believe, 1977 and 1981, you have, and don't hold me to any dates simply because I'm still a bit overwhelmed, just by the decency that manifested itself within him. And he was a peanut farmer. His father owned land, so he grew up farming, and he said that he liked to farm barefoot. So when you call Carter a son of the soil, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about a man that liked to actually get in there and get things done. And with respect to his accomplishments, well, first of all, he married the class valedictorian, and probably the most endearing moment in the videos that are scattered throughout the museum is simply President Carter looking at his wife with obvious love that, again, is quite clearly manifested. And you have somebody here who has a force of personality that is extremely powerful in an understated way. And you don't see that very often anymore. And I'm not sure why. But what's interesting about Carter is that James Earl Carter would be his name. His mother wanted him to be known as Jim. He became known as Jimmy. And if you just look at the accomplishments, right? Well, first of all, remember, he grew up, his father owned land and in the South, and basically employed under a tenant farming system, employed and treated his farmers fairly. And we know that because at one point, after some time, the black African-American farmer ended up owning the land that he had worked on for quite some time. And so we know that the tenant farming situation, which was probably, a sharecropping, also known as a sharecropping situation, was in this case a fair situation. And Jimmy Carter grew up as only, I believe, one of two white families in this small southern town in Georgia. And he obviously benefited from that minority status. In terms of his accomplishments, there's just so many of them. We can talk about the Panama Canal. He gave back the Panama Canal he signed so many treaties that persist to this day. And one of them was giving back the Panama Canal to the Panamanians. It was compared to, a situation where the United States, the Mississippi River in the United States would be owned by the British. In other words, it was a vestige of colonization, of investments. And to this day, the country of Panama uses the U.S. dollar, as well as, of course, the Balboa. They're interchangeable. And partly as a result of this treaty and Carter's legacy, Panama has become probably the most affluent country in Central America. And that, again, is because Carter, just out of human decency, knew that when students were protesting in Panama for national sovereignty, and some of them apparently were killed as a result of these protests. I don't know if it was by private security or whatnot. Carter, again, a man of conscience, knew that he had to do something. He couldn't have the deaths of those people, those students, on his hands without some sort of tangible benefit or legacy. So the success of Panama, including the American legacy within Panama through the U.S. dollar and otherwise, is a direct result of Carter's diplomacy. That's just one of the things. The other one is just the fact that Nixon gets a lot of credit for all the things that Carter did. We're taught in the United States about so-called Nixon's ping-pong diplomacy. That was only the beginning. It was actually Carter that created a relationship and nurtured a relationship with I believe it was Deng Xiaoping, the premier of China. And if you go into the replica of the Oval Office, you'll see not just a bust of Benjamin Franklin, but you'll see quite a few Chinese vases. You'll see a lot of gifts from China to President Carter during his time in the White House. And again, to the extent that you've had a successful situation in terms of either de-escalation or even opening up China's economy to the whole world, again, Carter deserves a lot of that credit because he continued and made whole what Nixon was trying to do, and of course couldn't get done simply because he lacked the credibility and lacked the reputation to get anything done in a lasting way. Back then, there was a strong commitment to trying to de-escalate tensions all around the world, and part of that would be the legacy of just getting rid of nuclear weapons. And again, Nixon gets a lot of that credit that really belongs to Carter. You have a lot of different SALT treaties, but there's quite a few of them, right? There's SALT 1, SALT 2, and probably under Reagan there's even more. And again, Carter was the one that helped. Under Carter, I believe it was SALT 2 that was negotiated. So Carter plays part of his legacy is denuclearization, at least in terms of weapons, all over the world, right? Because you do it in one country, and that's an example and a precedent for other countries. With respect to Camp David, because of Carter's work, the foundation was laid for a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. And I believe 4 or 5 years before that peace treaty, Egypt and Israel were at war. And after Carter became involved, after Camp David, there was a foundation that was laid primarily because of Carter's reputation and relationship. And as a result of that, he was able to go into Cairo and finalize a peace treaty. And because of his work, directly because of his work, no Egyptian has killed an Israeli, and no Israeli has killed an Egyptian on their soil since then. So you've got peace all over the world. There are a lot of other accomplishments that are not expressed in detail. They involve places like Zimbabwe and Argentina. In other words, Carter was able to, through the force of his personality, in an understated way, and simply his reputation and his ability to build relationships, he was able to get things done. And so you had, as a result, when Carter talked about human rights, he meant it. You can hear it in every word he says. He meant everything he said. And that obviously has an impact when you're trying to negotiate, when you're trying to be diplomatic. And part of his diplomacy was spreading an agenda of human rights all over the world that apparently had an impact as far away as Argentina. So you have a human rights record that resulted in tangible successes in the Middle East. You have a Panama situation. You have opening up of China, and without Carter, who knows what could have happened? It's not guaranteed that China's economy would have opened up, it's not guaranteed that China would have become an ascending power. It's not. None of these things are guaranteed, and to the extent that that Carter was involved, you can see that he was always talking about peace. He served in the Navy, and you'll notice that whenever he talks about the military, he always talks about peace in either the same sentence or the next one. And usually human rights are right along the way. And so you have a situation where, again, because he was coming in under post-Nixon, he was able to criticize the Vietnam War. He was able to criticize the actions that Nixon took against the reputation of the United States. And quite frankly, he was exactly what the United States needed after the Watergate scandal, after Nixon tarnished the reputation of the United States. And again, he couldn't have had a better man for the position at all. He said the happiest moment of his life was, making sure that when his successor came into office, Ronald Reagan, that he had freed the hostages in the hostage crisis in Iran. And this, was quite interesting because, again, one of his accomplishments was avoiding war with Iran. He said that he had a plan that allowed him to create a situation where he would be able to destroy the country of Iran through military action, but in the process of doing so would have killed tens of thousands of Iranians, as well as having endangered the lives, surely, of the hostages and military personnel within the Persian Gulf. And so he would have been able to create a situation where he could have shown or used the might of the United States military, but in the process of doing so, caused the deaths of all those hostages that eventually were released because of his actions, because of his commitment to making sure that his successor would be able to come in with a clean slate. And again, he called that the happiest moment of his diplomatic life. And you just look at all these different things. You look at his commitment to peace during his presidency, and that's just during his time as president. Obviously he married a class valedictorian, and they were both together instrumental in bringing just the idea of democratic values all over the world. And so in order to facilitate that, President Carter was participating in election monitoring all over the world. And this is, again, he's able to do so in an unofficial capacity, not on behalf of the United States government. And so that's just, again, the kind of things. He even managed to, again, after his presidency, negotiate a North Korean peace treaty that unfortunately apparently was never effectuated because Kim Il-sung was apparently died about a month after the negotiations. And so usually you have the negotiation and then the peace treaty comes after. You lay the foundation and then you get the lawyers involved, probably. And again, he managed to, through the force of his personality and reputation and integrity, he essentially managed to get the North Koreans to sign, to agree not to develop nuclear weapons. And again, this is all part of the umbrella of his accomplishments as bringing peace all over the world. And Carter, there's so many different things that he was able to do because he had integrity. And there isn't, and I've been to some other libraries all over the world. In terms of the presidential libraries, I've been to the one in Iowa for Hoover. Never really felt the need to cry at a presidential library or at any monument to a politician, except today. Because you have a man here who's good. And you have a man here who's good and still managed to be a politician in the United States of America. And I think what makes me even more sad is that, remember that Nixon disgraced the country. And Carter came in and healed the country. And Trump, of course, also has disgraced the United States, the reputation of the United States. And we need a Carter, but we got a Biden who has nowhere near the integrity or the force of personality or the commitment to human rights all over the world in a substantial way or in a lasting way as Carter. So we needed a Carter to come in after Trump, and we don't have one. And it's quite frankly, it's doubtful that we're going to get one within my lifetime. Somebody that is able to emulate Carter. And part of the reason for that is because Carter was able to win, I believe it was the presidential election. He was a state senator before then in Georgia, but I believe he was able to win the presidential election with $11.5 million of campaign financing. President Biden, I believe, had to raise $500 million. The mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, also contributed essentially to the Democratic Party another $1 billion. So you had about $1.5 billion being used on behalf of the Democratic Party in the year 2021, compared to 11.5 back then. Just $11.5 million. So you see that the chances of an unknown rising through the ranks today is unlikely. And the other part that makes Carter so admirable is because he grew into the role. If you look at his speeches as state senator, his speech was never could never be compared to a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X, but he became infinitely better at public speaking. And you would always listen to him simply because of the integrity that he had, that was obvious within him. He was friends with Martin Luther King. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. This is where Martin Luther King was born. And what's interesting is that, Martin Luther King, President Carter's father was a small businessman, I guess, and obviously a landowner. So Carter was never poor. But if you understand how farming works, the income is not stable, so you feel poor. And I don't understand how farming works at all, but I know enough about the economics of it to know that it's not exactly a stable situation in terms of income. So you may own a lot of land, but it doesn't necessarily help you if your harvest fails. And so a lot of farmers, especially small ones, are in debt continuously. And so what's interesting is that Martin Luther King was born essentially in a very big, a moderately big house in a middle-class black neighborhood. And so you have a situation where the President of the United States came from lesser circumstances as Martin Luther King, even though, again, they were born in the same state. So one white, one black, but it was the black man who was born into relatively more comfortable circumstances. I know I'm missing quite a few of the other accomplishments, but again, the major ones would be the Panama Canal being returned peacefully to Panama, and thus and having that good relationship ensured the use of the American dollar as part of the currency, thereby, of course, maintaining American prestige and influence within Central America. You had the fact that Carter avoided war with Iran. He spoke about, we have, of course, Camp David. We have the human rights records, the advancement of human rights. We have the opening of the relationship with China. We have the SALT II, which helped create a situation where getting rid of nuclear weapons was considered a viable goal back then. With the hostage crisis, what was interesting is that something I didn't know was that he believed, or at least it was insinuated, that the Iranians, under orders from the Ayatollah Khomeini, had taken over the embassy and therefore the American embassy and therefore the hostages, because the Americans admitted the Shah of Iran into the U.S. for treatment. So in other words, the Iranians told the Americans, give us back the Shah, whom we believe to be totally corrupt, and we'll put him on trial and probably give him the death penalty. Didn't mention that part, obviously, but had he been returned, he would have been executed after a trial. And Carter refused to send back the Shah, again, because he was a humanitarian. What may have been his greatest mistake came out of a humanitarian desire, just that consistent policy of being a humanitarian, of letting in a diplomat who was at the time an ally of the United States, despite again, the Shah's poor human rights record. He was still an ally of the United States. And of course, I'm sure Carter was attempting to try the best he could to remediate a lot of the issues under his regime. And Carter, I don't think, probably gave it a second thought. He did actually say, what if the Iranians, take some Americans as, if we admit the former Shah of Iran into the country. And apparently there was silence in the room when Carter mentioned that possibility. But it was never not admitting somebody into the country that was an ally for humanitarian treatment is probably something that Carter, just in his bones, could never have a request that he could have never denied, not given his record, not given who he was. And it appears that when the American government refused to give back the Shah to the Iranian government, the new revolutionary government, that may have led to a chain of events that led to the hostage crisis. So again, that was apparently based on a humanitarian request, or at least partially based, as a reaction to Carter's granting of a humanitarian request for medical assistance. I'm just trying to think of anything I've missed. Those would be the big ones. Just peace throughout so many places in the world. That's just during his time as President of the United States. After his presidency, he's continued to tour the world. He went to Cuba. He gave a speech in Spanish to the Cuban people. He went to a lot of places. He worked in Africa, eradicating a lot of different diseases there as part of the Carter Foundation. And so he's done just a remarkable number of things throughout his life. And again, it really does seem as if we need someone else like him in this country. And if you are in the Democratic Party, I think the step that people should take is trying to figure out how to find another Carter who won every state in the South, including Mississippi, except for Virginia. I don't know what Virginia's problem was, but he won every state in the South. And when he won Mississippi, that was it. That was when he knew he'd won the election. And it was a close election. I believe in terms of the popular vote, he only won by 2% of the vote. But he carried the South because it was from the South. It was a man of the soil, a son of the soil, and a man of the earth. And I suppose the salt of the earth. And if you are going to travel to Atlanta, I suggest you come here and visit.